because of our URL, some people get in touch with Telecoms.com thinking we're in charge of telecoms, full stop.
The whole of the telecoms market.
Yeah, just
Brilliant.
telecoms. This is where you come for telecoms shit in general. And so sometimes we just get random comments on stories or people emailing us going, my phone's busted. What are you going to do about it? Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're recording this one a day early because it's the 1st of April and 2nd of April is Good Friday when we all get to eat chocolate or something. I don't know what else happens on Good Friday. I'm going to cook some lamb on Sunday because that's what you do, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's certain things
or you get your mum to do it.
No, my mum's in the Canary Islands, so
that's a long way to go.
Yeah. And Ian, if I went there, I'd have to wear a mask outside.
Heaven forbid.
And fuck that, eh?
Yeah, exactly.
We'll get onto that actually, because I don't want to go off on too much of an early tangent. So yes, this is a bit early, which means we haven't got much to talk about, and we're going to have to keep it short because Pierre's got some grown-up stuff to do. So I'm gonna crack on. I'm just going to say before I do crack on. So I've got my usual beer here, but Ian, you've started drinking some different beer. What's that? Hazy Jane. Why is it called Hazy Jane?
That's what it looks like.
Oh, because it's claddy.
It's like remember Hogarden? You used to go in the pubs.
It's not a wheat like beer though, is it?
That's good. It's a good question. Is it wheat beer?
No, this is not a wheat beer. Come on, Ian.
Pierre likes Hazy Jane as well.
It could be. Hang on a minute.
It's like a fruity IPA.
So it's an IPA. It's a bit more fruity and it's opaque. And
it tastes pretty good, but I didn't feel very well. You had a couple of
tins and it gave you a banging head this morning.
Well, it's only that big, so I'm guessing the headache was caused by something else.
Right.
The can says "embrace the opaque." Actually,
good stuff.
But it does look like one of those beers that you, when you get served the dregs in a pub and you drink it anyway, and then the next morning you wish you hadn't.
It reminds me a little bit of my experiments with home brewing when I was a student. We just thought, let's make it really strong. So we just lobbed loads of sugar in there, and the yeast just went mental, and you ended up with this sort of Marmite-y effort that was just undrinkable and shite, and probably wasn't even that alcoholic. We didn't give it a lot of thought. Anyway, what we're going to chat about this week, we both had the distinct pleasure of listening into a marathon press event for Huawei to announce its annual report for 2020, and it's worth listening in because Huawei is not a publicly listed company, so it doesn't really have to do annual reports and stuff. And we've often bitched and moaned about how it's not that transparent when it comes to sort of corporate data. So we're kind of obliged to listen in when it does it, and so we'll review that.
Yeah, audited by KPMG, so it must be okay.
Yeah, that's it, because there's definitely no historical precedent for conflicts of interest with auditors. Cough, financial crisis, cough. But I'm not suggesting that in this case, KPMG and Huawei's lawyers. Just making a little joke, that's all. Just calm down, all right? And then we're going to talk about RCS, which is something that the telecoms industry have been talking about, it seems, for decades. To apparently little effect, but Ian, you've been mulling it over this week, and Pierre just messaged me RCS. This is a little play on words.
Could have done something with the headline.
Well
maybe
done,
with
Pierre.
it,
The English is really coming on there. So we're going to talk about that, and we might use that as a bit of a segue into talking about sort of some big tech stuff that I've been writing about. And then we're going to conclude with another little look at the chip situation. Ian, you've been thinking about it from a UK perspective, and today I just wrote about TSMC. So we'll conclude on that, but I'll try and be a bit more disciplined than usual because we've got to wrap this up in less than an hour. Just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site, you can also check it out on Facebook and YouTube, and you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, loads of other podcasting platforms. And before we move on, Mr. RCS is going to give us an update of who's been listening to the podcast this month. Take it away, Pierre.
Yes, so the city of the month is Orrington, Maine.
Maine,
Congratulations. Yes.
Okay.
With an interesting, so second is London, and an interesting third spot is Jeddah in Saudi Arabia.
Don't they always seem to come up quite high, Jeddah? Somewhere in Saudi Arabia always seems to have a lot of listeners.
Yeah, we don't get bad traffic.
They're quite high-techy, aren't they?
When we do Middle East stuff. Don't get bad traffic. So, yeah, they are quite techy, and then you get a lot of sort of investment and all that sort of thing. I think it's STC, the Saudi telecoms company, they seem to always be ahead of the curve in terms of certain technologies. So, fair play to them. Cool. All right, then. So, Huawei. So, yeah, they did this. They got this annual report, and they did a big press event, which obviously we're all dialing in on video. I managed about a couple hours, and then I got bored, if I'm honest. Again, sorry, Huawei. I've got a shitty attention span. And also, I'm the main writer on the site. I had to get on with my life. But you stuck it out. So why don't I hand it over to you, and you give us your recollections.
Yeah, it was long. I think they had an hour and a half with the presentation in China, and then there was a separate Q&A afterwards, actually, with some UK journalists, with Victor Zhang, who's one of their vice presidents. But I think he used to be CEO, actually, of the UK business at one stage, but he's now just sort of vice president, government affairs spokesperson. But I mean, the message is
demotion, doesn't it? Is it demotion or a rotation?
I don't know.
They like
it's probably a rotation, I think. There's a lot of rotating going on.
What is it about China? They fucking love a rotation, don't they?
Well, it makes it all seem a bit more egalitarian, doesn't it?
Rotating nowhere.
He's the only person who doesn't rotate, but everybody else is still
right
up for
here,
it.
mate. Yeah.
No, I suppose that the headline numbers, if we're looking at the performance, which everybody was wondering about, what impact is last year going to have had on them, because they've had a pretty bad year in terms of pressure from the US, which has included sanctions cutting it off from a lot of its key suppliers, as well as various countries like the UK, for instance, saying we don't want Huawei anymore selling 5G equipment. So there was speculation, I think, about how much this would have hurt Huawei, and there's no doubt that it's the wheels are sort of coming off. I guess you look at them in the past. I think last year this time they've been under pressure then, and they still managed to report about 20% growth in sales.
Right,
and it's right down to about, I think it's about 3.5%. Was it? I'm struggling to remember exactly what it is.
Revenues were 3.8, and net profit was up 3.2%.
Yeah, I don't think net profit grew much last year at all, but the sales growth's interesting, because that obviously points to what's happening on the business side, and that's a big drop off. And then if you look at the breakdowns they do provide now, they're never as detailed as what you get from an Ericsson or a Nokia. There's a lot less information in the annual report. There's a lot more waffle about initiatives and things like
certainly was
connected cows and all this sort of stuff, and various other things that you can do with 5G, and a lot less kind of hardcore data and numbers. But there were some interesting things. So the networks business was basically flat. It didn't really grow at all. After growing, I think, about 4% last time round. And I think what's happened there is it's probably not that much of a surprise to people. And if you look at the regional numbers as well, which they don't break down by segment, so it's a little bit hard to figure out.
So just to clarify, they give us overall regional breakdown, but they don't do it by business.
No, they don't. But the suspicion is that they've basically done well. They've grown because of China, essentially, and that probably goes for all the separate business units, smartphones, or rather, should call it consumer, because it covers other devices as well, networks, and the other one's enterprise. And outside China, basically everywhere's down. So Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, which I think is their second biggest region, it obviously covers a lot of that, was up last year, but it was down quite a lot. It's down about 12%, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Round. So that's a big drop off.
That's a big drop off. Now that to me just points to, if you look at the network side where it's flat overall, you're just thinking to yourself, it really tells a story that they've had this massive 5G rollout in China, 700,000 base stations built last year. Most of that work's gone to Huawei and ZTE. And it's just a huge volume of business for them, and it's sort of helped to protect them against the drops they've seen elsewhere. And there's no doubt they've had problems in Europe. We've seen several countries, banning them. And as a result of that, operators have turned around and done deals with Ericsson and Nokia instead. And it's not a surprise because we just come off the back of, seeing what Ericsson and Nokia had to say about their results, where both those companies are now sort of claiming wins and fairly good business in a region that's not really growing. They've managed to sort of up their revenues slightly, I think, and it's basically come at Huawei's expense. And then, the other interesting thing, I suppose, is smartphones, where, arguably I think the sanctions that have been announced, some of the stuff that the US has done on the chip side probably had a bigger impact on smartphones than other parts of the company so far. We've, people that well, Scott, like Strategy Analytics and Counterpoint, have been coming out with numbers saying their market shares dropped a lot.
Yeah.
And I think last time round, again, they'd sort of grown revenues by about 34% in the consumer unit. And this time it's, what was it, 3 or was it a little bit more than that? It's about 3%, I think.
Yes, it was 3.3%, exactly.
So, it's a big difference, a massive drop. It's still, I mean, the interesting thing to me is this still isn't bad, is it? If we were looking at this as a Western company at the moment, if you were looking at this as Ericsson or Nokia, people would be going, well, that's pretty good during a, coronavirus pandemic. They've grown revenues by 3.8% and the devices business is up 3%. But I suppose we're just used to these phenomenal sales figures that we're seeing
that flat carrier business one I thought was especially interesting. Again, we're having to make some assumptions as to what the regional split is by business unit.
Yeah.
But China now accounts for pretty much
66%. Yeah, and it was 59% the year before.
Yeah, and
so that's a big difference.
That increased by 15% in terms of revenue in China. So 2/3 of all of Huawei's revenue comes from China. And yet it was still only flat on the carrier side. And that's when China is supposed to have been on a 5G tear in 2020.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing by itself. I mean, to me, that just says, I suppose crudely, that the gains in China have just been offset. As we said, EMEA is down 12%. I mean, even the rest of Asia Pac is down 8.7%.
Yeah.
In terms of how much it relies on, EMEA is definitely its second biggest. In 2019, China was about 500 billion renminbi. I'm going to stop saying that because it's doing my head in. That's 500 trillion things. And EMEA was 200.
Yeah.
And then Asia Pac 70, Americas 50, others 20 odd. So very, very much the sort of second biggest. I think it was basically about a third.
Yeah.
It's 200 out of about 850. So yeah, more like a quarter, but there we go. And anyway, and so any drop off there, that 12.2% drop off is going to be very significant. And judging by the fact that it's flat on the carrier business, I think it seems that a hell of a lot of that is carrier business drop off. And incidentally, the split among the business units is over half of it is consumer now.
Yeah, well, it was before anyway. That became the biggest one last year.
I mean now as in the last few years.
Yeah.
And then we've got most of the rest of it is carrier, but then there's a decent chunk of enterprise, which actually grew a fair bit.
Well, I think that's
23%.
Yeah, I mean, on the carrier, I'm not sure that it's dropped off as much as people might think. I mean, yeah, there's been this big 5G rollout in China, and that's great. But the Chinese operators have spent a lot of money. I think the year before they were spending quite a lot of money as well.
Right.
So if you look at their actual capex increase, then it's brought some benefit. But there's a lot of operators in Europe that have stuck with Huawei. That's the thing we've got to remember. It's 12% down's bad, but it's bad, but it's not a disaster. And I suspect some of that is also because people haven't been buying Huawei smartphones.
Okay.
I think on the carrier, I think on the consumer side, there's been an impact. I think on the enterprise side, where it grew massively after being fairly flat, I think last year. I mean, that to me is a sign of what they're trying to do really with their strategy. And that's one of the kind of takeaways I think from the whole presentation was this
more
You know,
services and stuff.
we're going into AI, we're going into software, and they made this big thing about the
There was
harmony.
a big emphasis on diversification, wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it's things that they can do where they're not subject to US sanctions, right? It's, you know, what's the answer to the US sanctions program? And the two things to me came out of this. One is there isn't, I mean, I've been writing about this for a few weeks now, just from sort of speculating about alternatives that Huawei can find to people like TSMC, which is absolutely crucial for it as a kind of, you know, semiconductor maker. And the message I've been getting back from talks and with experts and people who know a lot more about it than I do is that they're not going to find a short-term answer to that. And therefore, I think they're saying we need to push more heavily into some of these other markets to sort of defend our business and to protect our, you know, revenues. And they've also realized that this whole campaign to persuade Biden to change his mind and to get European countries to act nicely and, you know, and accept Huawei into their networks again is probably a lost cause. Yeah. It's, you know, I mean, Ken Hu came on, you know, answering questions from journalists and made this big thing about how it's a lose-lose situation for everybody. Yes. But it sounded quite desperate to me. You know, it's almost like they're still sort of holding out a little bit of hope maybe that they can persuade the Biden administration to change things. I mean, they were saying things like they were specifically talking about US vendors, weren't they, and how business is going to move away from US vendors and it's going to go to other companies because of these sanctions. And that's the way the world works. It just finds a way around things. And there was obviously a bit of
truth in that.
There is some truth. I'm not saying they're wrong, but there was this kind of, I don't think they realize that it's almost like they don't realize that there's the will of the Biden administration is pretty, you know, resolute, I think. And I don't think they're going to change tack on China in the way that perhaps Huawei had hoped before he came in. And, you know, and so I think what they're doing is they're trying to find things in the meantime. Now, I have no doubt that there's some big concerted push, and it's not just Huawei, and it's been covered quite a lot, to build up a sort of semiconductor business within China and to make sure that companies like SMIC, which is their big foundry, have the kind of same capability in the future as TSMC. But it'll take them a few years to do that. And I think in the meantime, what they're doing is trying to, if ever, maybe. But I think in the meantime,
because it's not like they're not chasing a static target.
No, that's the thing. I suppose you can that TSMC is going to be even more advanced by the time they get there. Yeah. So how quickly can they? But I'd never put anything past the Chinese. You know, they just throw so much money at things and have experts.
Yeah, and they're really industrious and really well
they're
educated.
Really industrious. They'll you know, they'll go and maybe do some things that, you know, are slightly, you know, suspicious as well. Not Huawei I'm talking about here. I'm talking about China. You know, to try and work out how to do things better, as you know, as they've been accused of doing in the past. You know, I wouldn't put that past the Chinese government.
Do you know, I wonder about that. I mean, I don't want to talk about it too much because we're going to talk about chips at the end. But I wonder, you know, even if we accept the worst characterization of the Chinese as IP thieves and general piss takers, I wonder how much of that you can do. Like last week, we chatted about, you know, Intel's misstep going for immersion lithography rather than extreme ultraviolet, and you know, I don't know what any of that shit is, but clearly one's better than the other.
Yeah.
You know, I think a lot of the best practice is known. It's just doing it. But yes, I mean, it is money. Anyway, I don't want to preempt it because money's a sort of link for talking about chips later.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, I thought, you know, further to your reading between the lines as to what the tone of the presentation was, yeah, I took a certain degree of defiance from it. As I wrote in my piece, they're sort of saying, we've taken America's best shot and we're still doing all right. I thought that the reason to bang on about their numbers is twofold. One, to show that they are transparent. And look, we've been audited by a big four Western auditing firm, which, you know, we joke about it, but we certainly, unless we have any evidence to the contrary, we have to assume auditors are doing their job properly. I've just always found, this isn't specifically directed at KPMG, I've just always found the conflict of interest in auditing weird because you pay the auditor.
Yeah.
And presumably, whenever there's a commercial relationship, there's some capacity to put pressure on them to
I mean,
you know,
that whole industry is very questionable anyway. There's only 4 big auditing firms, and it's it's very very dodgy how that operates anyway. So I don't think the fact that KPMG looked at its books really sort of counts so much. I mean, they'll obviously want to draw attention to the fact that they got a Western auditor to go through, and I don't actually know what the situation was with Huawei's previous annual reports. I mean, is this the first one where they can slap sort of KPMG's name on it, or have they not had ones before where they've done the same thing? I don't know.
To what, and to what extent, given that there are so few actual data points in it, what does auditing even mean in this context?
Yeah,
well, I mean, exactly. A real audit involves them just getting right inside your business and going through tons of paperwork.
The thing to me, though, is that this is there's still so much that they don't publish, and that details that you don't get that you do get in in Ericsson and Nokia's reports. Things like basic country breakdowns. And Victor Zhang got asked about that, and they weren't going to disclose those numbers. I know Ericsson and Nokia don't disclose everything either, so I'm not saying that it's something that only Huawei does, but there's just a lot. There's a lot that you don't know, and there's still so many questions they haven't been able to answer. I mean, that was kind of the headline of my piece. This whole, a year ago when I think the whole sort of TSMC situation had arisen, the fact that they've been cut off from, out of all the sanctions, I think that's the one that you sort of identify as the massive problem for them, is that particular,
Well, yeah, I'll add some to that, but yes, that's one of.
Yeah, okay, but it's a huge issue that you can't get chips that that actually made. One of the few companies that makes chips in the world, one of the few foundries, and it's also the most advanced there is in the world. And you need that advanced equipment for your smartphones and your network equipment, and you can't get that, and you don't have a solution to that. That's a major problem. And they've not been able to answer that question for a year now. They've still not going to be able to say, I mean, even if they were to, they probably don't want to come out and say, well, it's a 5-year project and China's working on it, do they? Because then the question is, well, what do you do in those 5 years? But the thing is, if these results were bad, right, in terms of the growth stalling and going from a 20% growth down to 4%, what's it going? Because I'd read in a Bloomberg story, and I don't know where they got this, but things were particularly bad for Huawei in the fourth quarter. They don't break things down on a quarterly basis, but there was Bloomberg who got wind
perfectly
of the
believable.
fact that,
some of their chip stockpiles will have started to
and
deplete.
People that I've been talking to have been saying June's a bad time for them on the network side. There's some of the stuff they're going to run out of. What's it going to be like over the next year? We've seen this massive slowdown. Are they actually going to have a decline for the first time in? I don't even know if they've ever actually reported a decline before, but it's hard to see how 2021 is going to be a very successful year for them. And these initiatives they've got to do pig farming or whatever it is, or mining, or things that are really sort of tangential to telecom and IoT stuff, and move more into AI and software. That's great, but they're probably not going to be able to make up the revenue in those areas.
And there's plenty of other companies. I mean, there's a lot of others. One of the whole points of this sort of 5G era thing is that everyone's getting involved, other verticals.
I mean, the thing is that the Chinese market is so big that if they, and this is, talking about the enterprise business, and one of the reasons I think it grew so much is because apparently they're now the second biggest public cloud in China. I didn't know that before. I mean, I knew they had a cloud business they were trying to get going, but, I didn't realize the extent to which that was, now it's probably way behind what's the big Chinese one.
Alibaba?
Alibaba, I suspect, is the biggest public cloud in China.
Yeah, well, that might change because Xi Jinping keeps victimizing Alibaba.
Right, but it could be one of those skews where AWS is huge and then the next one down, which is what Google
is miles
Azure
off.
Is miles off. It's probably similar, but still, to be able to say we're the biggest public cloud in China, if they can do enough of these things, we've got a public cloud in China, we're still selling phones there, we're rolling out some AI software, we're providing these services to mines to do this. Maybe there's enough they can get going just in that market of 1.4 billion people or whatever to actually keep things fairly flat. But as you said,
it's a bit of a transformation.
It's a bit of a transformation, and they're clearly becoming a Chinese company. They've had this sort of internationalist phase that I think is now kind of coming to an end in a way, and the fact that this share of revenues, as you said, 2/3 of revenues now coming from China, and it was it was in the 50s, in the high 50s before. It's just becoming more dependent on its domestic market.
Yeah, one thing I'm going to wrap it up in the name of time discipline, but one thing I want to say when I wrote it up, so I came to the same conclusion as you, which is like fair play to Huawei for sticking it out, but financial year 21 could be a different story. And certainly, if you extrapolate these, what do you want to say?
The other thing that's interesting, because we were talking about profits, I think, before we came on.
Well, I was just going to talk about that. If you let me get a fucking word in edgeways. Well, I'll say my bit, and then you may have had a different angle on it. But I looked at the table for profit. Their margin went down a percentage point. Their profits went down about 7%, but their net profit went up. And I was like, I might not be the head of KPMG, but I don't see how that happens. And then I just had a little look further down their financial report. And it turns out they're paying 50% less income tax this year than last year. Yeah, now, there could be and when I published it this way, I got the impression from Huawei, they were like, "What are you trying to say, Scott?" And I wasn't trying to say anything. I was just trying to say that is how that counterintuitive set of figures comes about, and there could be perfectly legitimate reasons for it, or it could be the Chinese state helping them out. And even if it was the Chinese state helping them out, so fair enough. The US state is trying to destroy them. I actually think in this case, while we can criticize China for not playing by sort of WTO rules, I think in this case, if the Chinese state would be remiss to not offer Huawei a bit of a helping hand, given how much shit it's had to deal with. Yeah. But I'm sure it's all totally kosher and legit and audited and all that sort of thing. But one thing I did say at the end is, can they continue paying so little tax? Because that was a lot of money they didn't pay in tax.
Yeah.
And we'll see. But what were you going to say about profit?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, the tax one, because as you say, it allowed them to kind of maintain this margin. They have about 7.2% profit margin. And if they'd not had that tax benefit, if you like, then that would have suffered. But it's really interesting looking at a loss. Yeah, it's interesting looking at the operating margin at the company, which says more about what's sort of going on without those financial items. And that's gone down. So it was 10.2% in 2018, down to 9.1% in 2019, and then last year it's 8.1%.
Indeed.
And a lot of that is they're still funneling massive amounts into research and development. I mean, and the increase in R&D spending was a huge. Again, it was like, it's 21 point something, 21 billion or something, more than that on R&D, up by about 1.6 billion. On what they spent the last year. And to do it without the operating margin suffering even more, I've noticed, is there's a lot of job cuts happening. I mean, they're a bigger organization overall, but if you look at the numbers and the percentage of people in R&D, they've basically hired, and this is one of the reasons, obviously R&D spending's gone up a lot, 9,000 extra staff for R&D in the last year, but they've cut 6,000 jobs from the rest of it, which is about 6% of the total. They've cut from
there's a table I put up which total operating expenses. So R&D's gone up, but as a percentage of revenue, it's only gone up by 0.6 of a percentage point. So in 2019, it was 15.3% of revenue. This last year, it was 15.9%, and then there's exactly the same decline of selling and administrative expenses, which is just other headcount, I guess. Yeah. Where that's gone down from 13.3% of revenue to 12.7%. So those two seem to be more or less offsetting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that backs up what you were saying. Okay, we better move that on. And again, I'll hand the ball to you because this is your bright idea. I haven't written about it this week, but I'm perfectly happy to chat about it.
It's not really a news story.
You what?
It wasn't really a news story. It was something that came to me because I was chatting with Synchronos about work they're doing in Japan.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And they wanted to talk about the rollout of RCS. RCS is it's one of those sort of initiatives that limps on from year to year, and you just sort of wonder when it's going to die, really. it's sort of in the same mold as things like WAP, if you remember, going back to all those days.
Wireless
and the whole
application protocol, I remember
yeah,
that.
all the kind of walled garden stuff. I mean, it first cropped up, I think, in 2011, 2012. So it is basically a decade old now. And it's a GSM association initiative that they were pushing under the Join brand initially.
Right.
And the idea is it's sort of interoperable multimedia services, really. You know, the kind of stuff that you get on WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger.
Yeah, or
that allows us to share photos and to get kind of push messages from organizations that include links in, and you can look at videos, and there's telephony stuff on top of it. It's basically more sophisticated messaging.
Yeah, so it's kind of WhatsApp, but done through
with
the
bells
carrier
and
route rather than the over the top route.
And the idea is that it's a platform. Therefore, if you're a Vodafone customer and you're communicating with someone who's a 3 customer in the UK, for instance, you get the sort of same kind of service because it's built on this sort of common platform, and it was therefore backed as a kind of industry initiative. And it was
and when people pitch it to me, it's always with the angle of this is a potential money spinner for operators,
exactly,
because then the operator, it's like reinserting itself into the commercial loop where the OTTs, the over the tops as we used to describe them, less so now, sort of basically usurped it by saying, I, Vodafone, can get in touch with you, brand Coca-Cola, and set up a marketing campaign over RCS with all our subscribers, which is different. I don't think WhatsApp's really in a position to offer such a thing in the same way. Yeah. So that was one of the big ways in which it's always been pitched to me as a commercial proposition.
Yeah, exactly. But it's never really, it's never really sort of gone anywhere. And analysts have always been quite negative about it. I remember reading some Analysis Mason commentary just last year saying that it's still not really supported by that many operators, and you tend to get markets where maybe 1 or 2 operators are doing it, but the other ones aren't. So the whole sort of interoperability promise and everything then sort of isn't there. And it really, so Japan's a bit of an exception. The reason Synchronos wanted to talk about it is because all the big operators there, so that's everybody apart from Rakuten, which is the new guy on the block trying to kind of make an impact, but still hasn't really done so. All the other ones sort of got together and decided that they were going to roll it out as a kind of concerted effort. So they have their own separate back office, systems, which Synchronos has kind of helped to set up. So all of that's kept separate, but it's the same kind of platform, and it's marketed under the same brand. It's Plus Message, I think it's called, and you can sort of download it on an Android phone from the App Store with a smartphone.
Yeah. Well, Google supports.
Google
RCS.
supports exactly.
I wrote a story last November about Google going all in on RCS, which I found a little bit confusing because if it's an Android thing, that makes it feel like less of an operator thing. I still find the whole thing a bit baffling.
True. Yeah, completely. Yeah. But the interesting thing about Japan is the fact that the operators have kind of done it together, which you don't really see happening much elsewhere, and and take up seems to have been quite good according to Synchronos. So they're saying there's about 20 million users at the moment, and that's a market where, NTT Docomo, for instance, has got about 80 million customers, I think, mobile customers at the moment. So 20 million is a decent number, for a service that I think got launched 2018. It's not years old, and it's got if there are that many people using it, it's got a bit of traction. And Synchronos is saying there's a few specific things in Japan maybe that have helped. One is the operators are quite well trusted in Japan. People kind of like the operators, and they have more, they maybe their NPS is a bit higher, but they're kind of regarded as trustworthy players, maybe more so than in some other countries. And
actually, there's a funny little segue on that.
Go on.
Because of our URL, some people get in touch with Telecoms.com thinking we're in charge of telecoms, full stop.
The whole of the telecoms market.
Yeah, just telecoms. This is where you come for telecoms shit in general. And so sometimes we just get random comments on stories or people emailing us going, my phone's busted. What are you going to do about it? Sort of thing. Yes, and there's been enough anecdotal stuff when we've written about operators where you get people bitching and moaning about operators. So it's interesting. I get the impression in the UK that there isn't a lot of affection towards telecoms brands.
Yeah, completely.
But I don't have any data to back that up. I could be talking shit.
Well, they're sort of perceived to be utilities more here, I think, aren't they? Whereas in Japan, I think they do have a reputation of being
They've done a better job.
Well, I mean, NTT Docomo has been regarded as one of the kind of tech pioneers, hasn't it, really, in the past? And it's heavily involved in sort of 5G standards development compared with a lot of other operators, for instance. So it does have that reputation. But I think that's one thing that's possibly important. And the other thing is that there's so the Japanese equivalent, I guess, of WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger is a company called Line, Line, which is it's quite a complicated ownership structure. I think its parent's a company called Z Holdings, and the companies that own Z Holdings are SoftBank, interestingly enough.
SoftBank's got a piece of nearly everything, though, isn't
SoftBank bets on every horse there is, basically. And then a South Korean firm called Naver. But Line's had a bit of a bad rap recently. So, I mean, they've been in... interestingly, this week, I think, or last week, they've been in hot water with the authorities over data breaches that occurred where technicians at a Chinese affiliate basically accessed subscriber data without the kind of right permissions. And, as a result, there's a big kind of kerfuffle going on in Japan. And I think the Japanese government said it's going to suspend its use of some Line services because it's a very popular service. And it's the same number of customers as NTT Docomo, 80 million users. And the other thing that, according to Synchronos, is that there's a lot of spam that you get from Line. So a lot of this application to messaging stuff, which I don't know about you, but I don't see that much of that on WhatsApp. I don't get a lot of spam messages coming through.
No.
Yeah. And apparently
I don't get any at all.
Synchronos was saying, the guy I spoke to actually is based in Japan. He says it's a much bigger issue with Line. And if you look at their revenues, they are obviously trying to make revenue in this way from this sort of ATP messaging. So I guess in a way, if there's a bit of a backlash against Line for these various reasons, and the operators are regarded as more sort of trustworthy players, then RCS has potentially a bigger opportunity in that market than elsewhere, which might explain why it's got a bit of traction. But the trouble is, you look at this 20 million figure, if you look at the results that the operators are coming out with, there's not a lot there to suggest that RCS has had any great impact at all on their sales. And there's some encouraging stuff about, Synchronos is talking about them doing the same thing and moving into application to person messaging. That's a big opportunity for them. And it's much better to do that over RCS than it is over, older SMS services. You get better click-through rates and you get more engagement and all of this stuff. But it's early days for that. And at the moment, there's still not a lot of evidence that RCS has really kind of done anything for them on the sales front.
Yeah, and on the, back to that Google thing, there's another little tangent I could talk about there. There's a story this week about T-Mobile US getting into bed with Google. The main thing people led with is it was ditching its more proprietary premium video offering and just getting in with YouTube Premium or whatever it's called. But the angle I took on it was more general, that it's like they've thrown in the towel on creating their own sort of application level differentiation, which has been a sort of narrative among operators for decades, certainly ever since we got the proper mobile internet and the likes of Google and Facebook and Apple kind of taking over the customer relationship where operators previously wanted to hold on to it.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was telling that T-Mobile had just gone, all right, we used to have a third-party messaging thing. Now it's just going to be Google Messages. We used to have a third-party. Oh, there was one other thing I can't remember. But basically it's going on Google, which to me was them saying, they tried to make it they spun it as best they could. But it's basically them defaulting to Android, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, there'll be some kind of discount built into Google Premium things like this YouTube TV or whatever.
Yeah.
But that seems to overlap with what you're talking about, in so much as it's all very well talking about RCS, but now Android is a full supporter of RCS. So if you have RCS on an Android phone, to what extent are you able to circumvent Google? I would have thought that would be quite difficult. But yeah, that's where we need people like Mary or whatever on the call who could probably explain the plumbing that goes on behind the scenes. But on a uneducated level, it
Well,
just seems that Google's kind of stolen their thunder already.
Well, they need it to be an app. That's the thing. They need it to be an app that you can get from the big app stores. And at the moment, the big app stores are Android and an Apple, obviously. So they need RCS needs to be something that you can go and this Plus message, you can go and download it from the Android App Store.
Yeah, and if you're buying
preloaded, but
from an operator, they'll come out preloaded as well. Probably
it's preloaded in Japan on handsets, but it's Android based, and that's something that's needed. Now, one of the problems actually for RCS is lack of support from Apple, as it happens,
right?
Which has never really got behind it. And I was talking to it's Dean Bubley actually at Disruptive Analysis, who we
he'll like this. He listens to the pod. Most weeks he's commenting on the pod on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, he was commenting on the sort of lack of support that Apple's sort of offered for it as being potentially, something that could really disrupt, because there's a similar plan in the US to Japan. There's this sort of cross-carrier initiative there where they'd, the idea would be that T-Mobile and AT&T and Verizon build this sort of common platform using RCS. And Dean was saying the fact that Apple's never really got behind it sort of bodes ill for that project.
Yeah, because they've got about 40-50% install base in the US.
That you really need that company to be involved to make it work. And if it isn't, then the prospects don't look good.
Apple will only get involved if it can boss the whole thing.
Yeah, but to your point about Google, there's obviously an issue there. Is how much of it then, because if it is something that's Google's heavily involved in, then how much can it be kind of framed as an operator response to the OTT threat if Google itself is taking a kind of keen interest in it and seeing it as an opportunity itself. I think that the thing for me though is that the Japanese story, even though it has some encouraging aspects to it, there's still no real sign that it's done much for the operators. It's not like, none of them really talks about this very much in recent annual reports or earnings statements. And there's no sign that any of this sort of, when it was first framed, Join was this big, it was this big revolutionary thing that was going to kind of save the operators, and it was the fight back they needed against the OTT players. Now you look what's happened since then. I think when it was first announced, WhatsApp had something like 100 million users. It's now got 2 billion.
Yeah.
Line hasn't slowed down in Japan in the period that Plus Message has been launched. It's picked up another 7 million customers or something. It's gone up from about 70 to 80 million in the 2 years that Line's appeared. So, and it's making money. So it's still very hard to look at RCS and feel very positively about it.
Yeah. Go on.
I was just going to say the other thing that's interesting is, Synchronos itself it's an interesting player, isn't it? Synchronos. I mean, I was looking through their results and they've obviously had a really bumpy ride over the last few years with all sorts of things going on.
Well, as I'm sure you remember, I documented it quite extensively a few years ago.
You did, and you wrote some really good pieces on it, and you kind of got into the weeds in a way that I never have. But I was just looking at some of their headline stuff, and I don't know what's been going on, but their revenues have really, it's like they've exited various opportunities in the recent years because their revenues have come down so much. And the messaging business, which is the one that they're talking about when they're pushing things like RCS, when they're talking about that as an opportunity for them to do some of the plumbing and get business, their messaging business has not been doing very well. There was a big drop off last year. You look at their share price, right? I'd look at their share price movements over the last few years. It's lost 92% of its value since 2016.
Wow.
It was worth $3.69 earlier this week. Back in 2016, it was worth close to $50.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to recapitulate the stuff I wrote about. You can, if people are interested, they can go on Telecoms.com and look for the headline, "What the hell is going on at Synchronos?" Or something like that. But yeah, there was some weird stuff going on. There was some creative accounting going on, all that sort of thing. And they had a CEO who bailed after a few months. Then you got a chap called Glenn Lurian, and then he legged it. He legged it, from AT&T. Well, they had a bunch of AT&T people come in, and he legged it, and no one was really sure why. It was all quite abrupt. And our friend of the podcast, Mary, was there. She left before Glenn did, and I don't have any inside information on why she left, and even if I did, I wouldn't
Yeah.
betray her in that way on here.
But they're a
But
company
when I was
that really
chatting to
needs
Mary
this.
about it when she was there, I seem to remember her talking a bit more about like bespoke cloud and that sort of thing. But again,
Right.
they got the same problem of, Google's got a good. That was the other thing that T-Mobile did. That's it. They had a bespoke cloud thing. For all I know, it's Synchronos, and they've ditched it, and they're just going Google Drive.
Yeah, I mean, they're a company that really needs some kind of growth story to. I think they announced a lot of layoffs, didn't they, last year? I think they said that they were going to, and obviously Mary left when this announcement came
and
out.
Glenn.
10% of staff that I remember saying that we're going to get rid of. The interesting thing was their staff numbers don't seem to have changed much according to SEC filings. So I'm not sure what's going on there. But they're massively loss making. I mean, last year they had an operating loss of 48 million.
Right.
And it was down, that was down from 108 million the year before. But their sales last year were only 292 million, and that was down 6% as well. So, but they need something that's going to. They're going to struggle to break even without either really heavy cost cutting or something around the corner that's going to deliver a kind of big revenue boost for them. And it's hard to see where that's going to come from. If it's stuff like RCS that they're kind of pinning their hopes on, then there's just too many questions over that technology and too few markets where it looks like it's really doing something for it to sort of work out for them.
Yeah, I've got to admit, I haven't paid much attention to it since Mary bailed or left or whatever the circumstances of her leaving were.
Yeah.
Just looking at their share price, it's just been bumping along, not doing that much. Let's see. I suspect, without in any way second guessing how the things run. And like I said, I covered that a few years ago. I've no idea how it's run today, but they're in a tough spot trying to provide. That's where it's relevant to what we were just talking about. Trying to provide some kind of alternative mobile digital products to an ecosystem that's dominated by Android and iOS is always going to be a tough ask. And it looks like, looking at their share price and some of the stuff you've been describing, it's not a question they've been able to resolve so far.
Yeah, and meanwhile, just from a kind of consumer perspective, I mean, what is it that RCS is going to do that's really going to stop people from use? Because as I say, in Japan, the fact that they've got this claim to have 20 million users hasn't stopped Line from remaining extremely popular. It's still got 80 million users. I mean, are you going to stop using I use WhatsApp more than ever now, actually, as an alternative to just basic text messaging.
I use Signal quite a lot because I've got a mate who hates Facebook and is paranoid about them.
Yeah, but Signal's an internet app as well, isn't it? It's not an operator-led thing, or is it?
Yeah. No, it's equivalent to WhatsApp. Yeah.
It's equivalent to WhatsApp. So I'm dubious that people talk about. You hear people talking about RCS like there's still some legs in it and there's still an opportunity for it to do something. And it's hard really to see, just from a basic consumer perspective, what the pull is. Unless it does something really sort of radically different. And certainly if you're having to pay some kind of premium for it as well, and otherwise, how do the operators make money out of it? Then. I'm sort of. John Strand chatted to me as well. He came out with a good quote. So the day the operators succeed with a solution that kills Line is the day the Japanese stop eating sushi, which I thought was pretty good.
Fair enough. Yeah, they do like a bit of sushi, so I've heard.
Yeah.
Although I don't think we should. I don't think we should categorize them as solely eating sushi.
There is a lot of sushi consumed in Japan.
Yeah, you don't want to be a tuna that lives anywhere near Japan, that's for sure. Right, we better move it on. We've only got about 5 or 10 minutes left. Look, so going back to the chip thing, just very quickly, the stuff I was sort of alluding to earlier, the story I read today about TSMC, they've come out and said we're going to drop 100 billion more investment on stuff.
Yeah.
Now, as well as just after Intel had just said we're gonna dig up 20 bill last week, and as I wrote it, it's like they will see your 20 bill and raise it 80, and it's just an incredibly capital intensive business making chips. All the kit supplied by the likes of Applied Materials costs millions and millions of pounds. The technology, especially now we're down to these tiny nodes, this sort of extreme ultraviolet, all this cleverness. I was reading something that, the next node after 7 nanometers, 4 nanometers, and apparently they're doing all right on that, TSMC. But this is what I mean by the arms race of it all. It's all very well China going, all right, fuck this. we're going to just chuck the full weight of the Chinese state. And God knows they got a few renminbi to chuck around if they want to.
Yeah.
That. Let's say SMIC, right now is capable of whatever 20 nanometers. They got
14.
14, is it?
Apparently.
So it goes. So they're at least, let's say, 1.5 nodes behind TSMC.
I think it goes 14 to 10, then to 7, doesn't it? So
okay, so more like 2.5 then.
Yeah.
Given that
TSMC's on 5.
I thought it was. Okay, I thought it was 7. Oh no, I'm confusing Intel and
7.
TSMC.
7 it's reached, but it's doing 5 for Apple apparently. TSMC.
Okay, I thought that was 4. Fuck it, it doesn't matter. The next node. So they've got to not just keep pace with a company that's going to dig up $100 billion, but they've got to move faster than them. And I just don't know if brute spend is enough. I don't know what it is. I mean, they've got the education, they've got great universities, they've presumably got people who've forgotten more than most of us will ever know about chips and all that sort of thing. I just don't know what it is, but somehow TSMC has managed to keep ahead of everyone else, keep ahead of Intel, keep ahead of the Chinese, keep ahead of other foundries, global foundries, all that sort of thing. So there's something they're doing right. I don't know what the special sauce is.
But it's like, it's like trying to create an alternative to Silicon Valley, isn't it? Once you have something that's there, that exists, you have an ecosystem where you have all the venture capitalists in one place. It's got some of the best schools in the world. It's got some of the best companies in the world. It's like self-reinforcing. And I think it's the same with chips. They've got the expertise and the facilities up and running, and they have the business. And therefore, it's like when the US is looking to diversify or at least have semiconductor security, if you want,
or have its own telecoms vendor. You can't just.
But specifically to do with chips, who have they gone to? I mean, we've had the Intel plan, obviously, $20 billion in Arizona, but they'd already asked TSMC to come and do the same thing. TSMC's building a foundry in Arizona because they can come. And this is a big question this is one thing I wrote about this week was the European angle on this.
Yeah, I was going to say, we'll let you keep this one relatively short and sweet, and you can sort of take us home on that. Because
I was interested because partly, this is obviously a big issue for everybody at the moment. Europe's just come out with this plan for 2030 sort of technology ambitions. And the one that's the real headline one is by 2030, we want to generate 20% of the world's manufacture 20% of the world's semiconductors, up from about 10%, I think, in 2020. So it's doubling that figure. And obviously you've seen what's going on in the US with Intel getting back into the kind of game, and also talking about being a foundry as well. TSMC building stuff in Arizona. I think there's even been some kind of outreach to Samsung as well in this area. And then you've got the UK, which is, it's no longer a part of Europe. It's not in a very good situation in terms of its relationship with China at the moment. And, and we've seen with this whole coronavirus vaccines, nationalism that's been going on, what can happen with shipments and trying to rely on your near neighbors for, it's not hard to envisage that some of these, disputes that have been happening over the coronavirus vaccine and why aren't you shipping things? It's not hard to envisage similar things happening with semiconductors, especially given the supply shortages that are happening in the market at the moment. So you sort of think, what is the UK doing about a semiconductor strategy? And I chatted to this guy called Dr. Andy Sellers earlier in the week. He works for one of these the UK has these things called catapults, which are they're associations that basically provide strategic. They're almost like consultants, I guess, but they kind of advise. They're not for profit. They advise industry and government on core critical sectors. And
so where do they get their funding from then?
Well, some of it's public funding. Okay. It's partly public funding, but they get some from industry as well. So companies might come to them with a project. So it's partly public funding. But they're in talks with the government. So, for instance, Andy Sellers is one of these guys who got dragged into a lot of the stuff to do with the telecom diversification, issue when the government was having all of its parliamentary sessions, and we had people like Howard Watson from BT being hauled up before a parliamentary committee and asked for his views on all this. Then Andy Sellers is involved in that, and he's very much on the kind of semiconductor side of things. But I was asking him, is this a worry for the UK, this semiconductor issue? And, and the fact that we're all so heavily reliant on this one big Taiwanese foundry, what does that mean in the future, given all the kind of ructions that are going on? And And he was like, yeah, it is. And there's basically three things that they can do. They can just carry on as they do at the moment. And the good thing about the UK is we do have some foundries and some fabs, especially in compound semiconductors. So that's stuff that's not made with silicon. It's like gallium nitride and gallium arsenide. It's semiconductors that are used in other areas.
Oh yes,
and they do have some silicon fabs as well. They just don't have the kind of cutting edge stuff that we've just been talking about. This 7 nanometer, 5 nanometer. They tend to be in the kind of much higher ranges. So you'd still use those in certain applications, but you wouldn't be using those in the most advanced smartphones, for instance, or in the most advanced 5G networks. And when it comes to that, the options are basically to carry on doing what we're doing and try and just strike trade deals and emphasize the fact that we actually have a lot of design expertise in the UK. We've got companies like ARM, we've got GraphCore, which I think is like trying to develop the most advanced microprocessor in the world at the moment. You've got Imagination Technology. So there is a lot of design expertise. Or they can do a deal with someone like Intel. So they can basically go to Intel and say, we're going to buy, we're going to sign a contract where we agree to buy 10% or 20% of your foundry's future capacity, the one that you're building in Arizona, and try and lock something like that in. Or you try and do it yourself and you basically do what they've done in Taiwan and set up a foundry. And the trouble with doing that is, like, as you just said, TSMC is talking about 100 billion.
Yeah.
I mean, where's the money going to come from? You either have to get someone to build it or you use public funding. And where's the public funding at the moment going to come from for this?
I'll tell you what my gut feel is, and I'm going to have to wrap it up there. TSMC suddenly finds 100 bill. I reckon some of that 100 bill has been chucked at it by governments.
It's hard to see how not. I mean, they only make about 40 bill a year in revenue.
Well, indeed. They can go into the debt markets and they're making all the right noises about how it's a safe investment and who can deny that that demand for chips is only going to continue to grow. But I reckon the US, EU, UK, we've all gone, all right, we're going to throw some money in a pot now, build some of your geographical redundancy at least over here. So, everyone's wargaming China getting tasty over Taiwan because it's just over a little strait of water. And obviously China thinks it owns Taiwan anyway.
Yep.
And so what you want, the most efficient way to do it would be to have TSMC special source distributed around the globe. So that there's a very least geographical redundancy built into what they do. If China goes right wherever in that, then they can ramp up stuff that's almost like semiconductor sleeper cells in the US and in Western Europe. So that's where I bet some of the money's coming from, but that's just pure speculation. Anyway, we better stop it there because Pierre's got shit to do, and we've got to go off and have Easter eggs and roast lamb and stuff. So yes, and by the time this goes up, this will go up like next Tuesday, won't it? So it'll be about 4 days old. So it could all be completely pointless by the time it goes up. But there you go. All right, so thank you very much for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.